Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to give everyone a minute to get logged in, and then we'll get started.
Do you need us to stay on camera or is it okay to be off? I've been in lots of meetings already today.
You can definitely be off. If you can have it turned on, we do appreciate that. It always makes it, a little more fun and easier for the speaker. But no, we absolutely understand if you have to turn it off.
And hi, Melinda. Good to see you.
I know I was waving at you and I was like, okay, there's other people there. Why am I just waving at Chanel? How are you? It's so good to see you. I've been looking forward to this.
Thank you. Good to see you as well.
Still rolling in. All right. Welcome, everyone. Please mute yourself. So, out of respect for our speaker, if you can be on camera, please do so. If not, we completely understand. It just is more engaging for the speaker if you can be on. This session is being recorded, and that recording will be available on stopRED.org, along with other past sessions. So, feel free to check those out. At the end of the session, there will be a survey. Please take that survey. It's real short, but it does help us to improve our sessions and so that we can continue to get funding to offer these sessions. If you would, just ask questions at the end or put them in the chat just for to make sure we have enough time to get through the presentation. Um, Funds are made available for this project through the Missouri Department of Public Safety and the Missouri Juvenile Justice Advisory Group from funding provided by the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Our next lunchtime learning will be January 15th, and that will be with Dr. Betty Porter Walls on storytelling as a diversion. The CLE course code is 758692, and I will put that in the chat so that any of you requesting CLE course credit can do so. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Simmons.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for attending our session and for supporting our lunchtime learning. Today, we are really pleased to introduce Shanelle Dupree. She is the inaugural executive director of the Racial Equity Collaborative, which is a social service nonprofit. REC, as it is known, serves as a national model for engaging community partners in addressing systemic racial barriers for families of color in helping within the systems. And there is a link to that if you'd like to know more information. She is the creator of Skin Deep, DEEP, The History of Child Welfare by Race. Skin Deep is professionally produced on-demand course and webinar, and I hope she'll share some of that with you. She is a former social service administrator, a licensed Kansas attorney, wife and mama of four, author, and Bible study teacher at her church. She enjoys reading, writing, watching the same comedies over and over again. Now, today's presentation, Skin Deep, don't forget to lay the foundation. How can racial equity for families move beyond an aspiration and become a part of an organization's culture is the question to unravel today. And the answer will be shown in her curriculum, which includes a cultural ABC. Without further ado, I am honored to share with you and to introduce to you Shanelle Dupree.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Simmons, and thank you, Liz, for just the opportunity to be with you today. I like to describe myself as a strategic connector with deep Midwestern roots. So I was born in Nebraska, raised in Oklahoma, and now I'm living in Kansas with my law school sweetheart, where we are raising our four children, ages 12, 13, 14, and 15. I like to say that life is never boring in our home. And so with that, I am, and it was mentioned, a part of a larger organization called the Racial Equity Collaborative. And these are the ladies that I have the pleasure of serving with. It's a It's a nonprofit, but it started as a coffee conversation between myself and a colleague of mine. And we were talking about what our respective organizations were doing within the child welfare system regarding racial disparities and disproportionality. And we decided that we wanted to come together, and then we ended up connecting with the University of Kansas to have a statewide conversation so that people who are not only in the system working in social services, but people tangentially connected, right? So our educational partners, our health systems, our housing partners, our mental health system, our legal systems, all of our systems could come together to really understand from where you sit, how can you impact racial equity. Oftentimes we say, oh, well, it's that system's problem. It's that person's problem, right? But with child welfare, we have what's called mandated reporters. And mandated reporters are people who are required by law to call in allegations or concerns or suspicions of child abuse and neglect. And so we really wanted to ignite a statewide conversation. We thought, oh, it'll be maybe 100 people, if we're lucky, that come to this conversation. It was 700 people that came to the first meeting online, and it just continued to grow. And now we have, of course, a nonprofit that we formed. We have a federal grant that we're doing. We have a listserv that we would love for you to be a part of. And we do things like we bring people together from a diversity of backgrounds and perspectives, and we have engaging and important conversations like why do we keep confusing poverty versus neglect, right? How do we deal with those things? And then we have what's called interactive theaters, where we have the conversation about disparities and disproportionality in a very different way. It's a scripted way. It's a way where we can really pull out specific like decision points in different systems and work to ignite change. So that is what the Racial Equity Collaborative is, and it's a pleasure just to be with you on behalf of our organization. I want to ask you a question on today. And the question is, what is a tough but important conversation that you've had regarding your career, your family, or your health? You don't necessarily have to answer the question. You can if you want to, you can put it in the chat, but I want you to think about that. What is a tough but important conversation that you've had regarding your career, your family, or your health? And then what is a tough but important conversation that you haven't had regarding those things, regarding your health, your career, or your family? And so when I think about that question, those questions, I think about a time frame when I was experiencing, I was on cloud nine. My then fiance had just proposed to me. I was in my second year in law school, and we were planning our wedding. And I got a call from my mother, and she sounded like she was trying to remain calm, but she was a little frantic. And she said, "We just found out that your grandmother, her mother, had been diagnosed with stage 3 cancer." And she paused and she said, um, but she has known that something has been wrong for years, and she just didn't say anything. And so the question that immediately you begin to think about in our rational minds is, why didn't she say anything? Like, why didn't she say something? Why didn't she let us know what was happening so that we could do the things that were necessary so that we can ensure that she was healthy? What happened? What was the disconnect? And even though we know on a very intellectual level that there are consequences to not having important conversations and discussions, we all know someone personally, right, that maybe has been in that situation. Or maybe we're the person that knew we should have had that conversation, but we didn't. So so then it makes me think about, how does this show up in our helping systems? How does this show up in our social service programs? How does this show up in your world? And we're going to talk about that today, about having the discussion and laying a cultural foundation of awareness, bravery, and connection. But oftentimes, people don't understand what the consequences are for not having these conversations and these discussions. So we're going to watch a clip, and during our time together, I am going to show a few clips of the course that I created called Skin Deep. And this is a clip. So it's the history of child welfare by race. I created Skin Deep. I created this course and curriculum because when I was an administrator for a social service agency, in that role for 5 years, I really wanted to create a way to build awareness and cultural competency for our staff, right? It's in many folks' ethics. Like, you are supposed to be culturally competent. You are supposed to understand poverty. You're supposed to understand the impact of discrimination and fight against racism. Like, that's in a lot of folks' ethics and professional responsibilities. But how are we actually providing that training and those conversations for our staff? And so I got the go ahead from our secretary, and I asked to bring in some type of curriculum. And so I looked, I couldn't find anything. The only thing that I could find was regarding implicit bias. I wanted something that could specifically address racial disparities in how it impacted families in our systems, and I couldn't find it. And so fast forward years later, I created it. And Skin Deep helps family serving organizations to go from feeling helpless, right, with the systematic barriers and inequities that they see within their system, to having concrete action steps to begin building a foundation of equity for impacted families that they serve. So we're asking the question, what are the consequences? And oftentimes we can see the consequences in the data. And data, we know, is it's the numbers, but it's also the stories. It's also the experiences of people who have been impacted. And so for my system, right, the child welfare system, I want to show you a clip of what the consequences are for not having these important and impactful conversations on a continuous basis within our systems. Let's watch a few clips from Skin Deep guest lecturers on what data tells us about children of color in the foster care system and why it matters. You know, why are we even talking about children of color in the foster care system? How do children of color, how do different races show up in the foster care system?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, what I prepared was to look at just, you know, how many Black, Indigenous, and Latinx children are in foster care, and then thinking about this, looking at our national trends and thinking about it, and starting to delve into that. Why does it matter to even look at, you know, race in child welfare? And so the most recent federal data is from fiscal year 2022. Specifically like September 30th, 22, they look at how many kids are in care, and there were 368,000 kids in foster care. And that number has actually been steadily declining since 2017. And if you look at it by race, you can see of that 368, about 9,000 kids were Indigenous, 83,000, a little over 83,000 were Black. More than 79,000 are Latinx, and then 30,000, or about 30,000 kids were identified as 2 or more races. Well, what's important though is that, you know, so those are our numbers, and the trend says it's decreasing, but this is happening while the child population is also decreasing. So we have to have a good understanding of our racial equity data in foster care by looking at what's called the disproportionality index, which is a really big word, but a very important concept. And so this index compares the percentage that a racial group is in the child population to the percentage that that group is in the foster care population. And if those two numbers are proportionate, the same or close to being the same, then that index is going to be 1. If the index is less than 1, then that racial group is underrepresented in foster care. And then if that number is greater than 1, then they're overrepresented in foster care. And so I'm bringing this up now because nationally we're seeing this decrease in number of kids going into foster care. However, the disproportionality index shows us a different trend. And these trends, they vary by state, they vary by local jurisdiction, But at the national level, what we see is that Indigenous children are actually increasing slightly. So keeping in mind, the national trend is numbers going down, but the disproportionality index for Indigenous children is increasing each year slightly. So they're overrepresented, and they have the highest disproportionality with regards to overrepresentation, and they have an index of 3. So that means that Indigenous children are in foster care at 3 times the percentage than they are in the child population. Yeah. So it's a very large disproportionate index. For Black children, the disproportionality index has remained nearly flat for the last 5 years at about 1.65, so overrepresented at 1.65 at a national level. And then the trend for children who have more than one race is it's almost identical to Black children. And then finally, Latinx children, they're underrepresented in foster care when we look at national data, and that stayed very, very steady at about 0.85% for 5 years. However, we know with all of these that some states and local jurisdictions are seeing Latinx children be overrepresented. So it's really important. You look nationally, but then you go look at your state and, if you can, your local jurisdiction. Absolutely.
So why does that matter? Like, why does it matter that children of color are in the foster care system at a higher rate than they're in the population?
Well, I think it matters because we have lots of research that shows us that children who experience the foster care system of all races, that they have poorer outcomes than children who don't experience the foster care system. So poor education outcomes, poor health outcomes, poor mental health outcomes, just employment outcomes. There's so many things. And then, there's also research about foster care being a pipeline to prison. And so there are lots of ways that children are disadvantaged in our foster care system. So the fact that we have children of color, higher proportions of them going in the foster care system, it means they're being set up for experiencing more of these poor outcomes in their future.
So that kind of leads me to my next question is, why is data by race important to understand?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's important because when we see trends occurring in child welfare, we don't actually know whether those trends are occurring for everyone. So given, a really long history of racial disproportionality and disparities in child welfare, we really must examine outcomes to know which outcomes are happening for which children. And without looking at it by race, then there could be hidden trends that we don't know about. So data by race can show us where racial inequities are occurring. And I think a good example of this is from the COVID pandemic, where many, many jurisdictions saw dramatic declines in the number of children entering foster care. However, if you go look at those data by race, the trends are different for different racial groups. So before we start celebrating this decrease of kids in foster care, we need to look at who's actually experienced that decrease and who has not. And I just think it's important to analyze data by race so we can understand how different racial groups experience the system, identify patterns, strengths, and needs, and then that gives us the opportunity to target our efforts and tailor strategies or interventions for specific groups who are not achieving our outcomes.
And to ask different questions, right? Like, why is this working well for this group, but it's not working well for this group?
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking about numbers, but we've also been talking about experiences as well regarding the metrics. But can you talk to me about the different types of data that are available to collect? So I've heard it talked about there's quantitative and there's qualitative data. Can you talk to me about both and what your thoughts are on collecting both of these?
Yes. Most of the time when people talk about data, they're talking about quantitative data. They're talking about numbers, but really there are two kind of big types of data. And quantitative is, using numbers to represent trends and patterns. But qualitative data is information that's not represented by numbers, and we can get it in different places. So we can gather it from reviewing case records, for example. We could get it from observing court hearings, from observing case planning meetings, or other kind of important processes. We get it from interviewing people or holding focus groups with people. So I think what's important is qualitative data, like quantitative data, it can be analyzed for patterns and trends. We can examine people's experiences of the child welfare system, for example, by listening to their perspectives, analyzing their words, their stories, and looking for, are there patterns? Are there similar patterns across these, the words people use, the stories people tell? Are there trends that we're hearing about from those qualitative data? And they provide us with, much more in-depth, rich information that cannot be captured by numbers. So that makes them very, very important. And I really believe using both types of data are important, because no one source of data gives us enough information that we can make major decisions about people's lives. So pulling in the different types is really important. I also think it's important we hear from people who have lived experience of the child welfare system, because they're the experts on what they have experienced and what it has meant in their lives. And it's combining these two together that I think we will do our best work in advancing racial equity.
Yeah, so we understand that the data can really tell us what the consequences are, but at times our systems and our processes we don't even know what our data says, right? We're not even clear on where we stand regarding racial disparities and disproportionality. And so when we think about the reasons why we don't have these conversations, I just want to mention a few of them, and we'll watch a short clip connected to the first one. But the first one is fear, right? So when we think about just my personal story of why my grandmother didn't tell the family about what was happening with her, it was fear, right? She has a mistrust regarding the system, the healthcare system. And so she chose to handle it the way that she chose to handle it. And when we think about just the topic of diving into racial disparities and disproportionality, there's a lot of fear that people experience in that not wanting to say the wrong thing, right? Not wanting to do the wrong thing, not wanting to be labeled as a racist or as someone who is out of touch. There's lots of fear that at times can be connected with topics about poverty and race, and that's rooted in how our system, how America really has even approached the topic of race and the impact for everyone in America. So fear. Then we have politeness, right? I mentioned at the very beginning that I have deep Midwestern roots. So something about the Midwest that I hope you all would agree with is that we are a polite people. We're delightful, all right? But we are a polite people. So politeness at times leaves room for not saying the thing that needs to be said. And just also thinking about what goes under politeness. Sometimes it's how you were raised, right? So I'm from a military family, and being respectful, that's always something that was drilled into me, and that's really important. And so that can also show up in not saying the things and not having the conversations that need to be said. And then number three, feeling unsafe and unfamiliar. And it's really you're unsafe because you're unfamiliar, right? These topics haven't been put on the agenda. They're not something that we talk about. We say all the other things, but we don't say the thing that needs to be said. And then lastly, success is not defined. So we at times we may dive into this, but we dive into the topic not in a strategic way, not in a way where we're getting support with people who are professionals in this, and not in a way where we're clearly defining success and understanding that achieving racial equity is going to always be a journey. All right. So with that, we're going to And I think with this, the entire clip, the entire purpose of this is to, and I'm putting on my legal hat now. I teach a class at my at a law school, and one of the first things that we tackle is what is race? Like, what is race even? And what I'll say is that race is absolutely a social construct. It is something that was created to essentially create caste systems, to create categories, but it's been constructed. Right? It's something that we function, it's something that we operate in. And so we have to operate in it in the way that we have to operate it. And we're going to watch this clip because I'm just going to say all the things that the clip is going to say. Race as a social construct. Recently, I presented at a conference, and at the end of the session, a woman asked a question. Why are we even talking about this? Race is a social construct. It's not real. She went on to say a few other things, and I ultimately told her, we talk about race because racism has impacted people of color. We can dream to a place where racism is no longer a problem, but we need to work with where we are. And where we are is people of color have been impacted. So yes, race is a social construct, but it's been constructed, folks. And because it's been constructed in a way that harms people of color, it must be deconstructed through dismantling that disinformation about race and ethnicity, by remembering our history and using principles, laws, and our power to impact and preserve our most sacred relationships in this world, our family. I will not always say things the way you are comfortable hearing them, or the way that is currently politically correct, because it changes, right? But my intent is never to offend. However, if you are offended by the overall topic of race in America, you will be offended. We're going to talk about race. I'm going to say Black, brown, and white. I'm going to say Native, Indigenous, Hispanic, Latino, African American, Korean, Chinese, European, Latinx, Asian, all the things in different variations and in very different ways. And I won't always say things the right way all of the time. Welcome to being human. But deciding to continue on this journey of understanding someone else's experiences, it's what connects us. So let's listen to a skin deep guest lecturer on this very topic. I want to actually go back and pull in Bill and see what his thoughts are as well, because you mentioned external work and then also internal work. How was that conversation and narrative on deciding that you were going to begin talking about this and making this a priority for your organization as an all-white organization? So was there any, were there concerns? Was there feelings of, can we do this? Or is this something that we can step into? Or how do we prepare for this? What are some things that your team did to navigate in that space?
You know, Andrea gave me credit for beginning the conversation about allyship, and I want to give credit to the Toronto team up at the Toronto, Ontario Children's Aid Society, where they allowed me to do work with implementing a child protection practice, but then they were running into some serious issues with racism and wanted to address those. So within my time implementing this child protection practice came this strong push to go after the racism piece within the work. And they trusted me enough to bring me alongside their anti-Black racism leads within the organization. And I'll never forget a few things, and I'll try to contain myself here to a manageable story. But first of all, I just realized, okay, all these anti-Black racism leads are all Black, and we're going to be talking about that. And I'll never forget the fear I had of stepping into that, and the fear being, I just want to get it right. I want to say the right things, ask the right questions, all of that, and just didn't know what to expect. So just that was a huge impression. And then I hate to admit it, but within probably the first half an hour of my first meeting with that group of 12 people, I said, you know, my children, they might call me the slave driver at home because blah, 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 blah. And I just continued to tell the story about something relational with my kids. And then as we were approaching lunchtime, I was kind of reviewing in my head all the things we talked about. And then at lunch, I realized, did I say slave driver? And I did. And I thought, okay, I need to address that. And I hate the thought that I need to address it, but I got to step in there and I've got to say something. I've got to apologize. I've got to ask if, like, what that was like, or just what happened with that for them. And we get back from lunch and I stepped into that space and I asked, and I think the first thing I said is, I have to believe that you noticed earlier in the day when I used that term. Is that true? They said, yeah, we all noticed. And I said, I am so sorry. And I just want to hear, like, what is that like for you? And they, with such graciousness and patience, stepped into a conversation with me about that. And that was my first taste of that fear that I had to just enter the space. And then with humility, apologize, and then be courageous, like just be courageous. The other thing that
Yeah, so I really appreciate it's an organization that's in Minnesota, and they were a part of the Skin Deep curriculum. There were 12 individuals that were part of the curriculum. They were either identified as allies, right? Racial equity was important to them, or they were a part of the different communities that I'm going to be speaking about. So the big takeaway, right, the premise is that, right, what's the solution? How do you develop how do you develop this foundation? Well, you have to develop a foundation of cultural awareness, of cultural connectedness through awareness, bravery, and connection, right? So you have to dive in, you have to wrestle with the topics that impact that, and that is poverty and racism, okay? And so on the screen, I have the 3 C's of how companies and corporations, how we've seen what the commitment to racial equity actually looks like. And I'm going to say it, but I'm going to say it with literally no judgment. All right. So there's a saying that's going around: we listen and we don't judge. Okay. So it is what it is. And you can start something and you can always, right, grow and expand in it. But one of the ways that organizations show up to the work of racial equity is because of the cameras. And I say that meaning literally cameras, lights, camera, action. There's something that has happened in, maybe it's the media, maybe it's just within their orbit, and there is attention that has been focused on this issue of racial equity. And so the organization feels the pressure to do something. Okay. I experienced this firsthand when my first kind of professional role as a working in this space, it was because an organization, they had students who decided, who for Halloween they dressed in blackface. And for those of you who don't know, blackface is extremely offensive. It's rooted in really the Jim Crow time, where segregation and kind of one or two steps away from enslavement, essentially. So they dressed in blackface, and the students at the school were they were very upset that this happened. And so they demanded that something happen, right? So the administration, they decided that they were going to hire someone that could do this work as a diversity professional. And so I was hired in this role. And what I found is that I was hired in this role because of the attention that was that and the pressure that was put on this organization. But the organization really didn't have a deep commitment to this work. Not saying that they couldn't have, right? But they didn't really have a deep commitment to this work. And one of the folks that worked within the organization, they pulled me aside and they said, hey, I want you to know that you're an answer to a problem that they have right now. And you need to be aware of that. But these are the things that you should ask for, right? Even though, we're understanding why you're here. So I asked for those things and was able to do some good work and plant some roots. But when it was no longer a problem, right, I was no longer a priority within that organization. And so that's the danger with when organizations commit to this work because of the cameras. Once the cameras leave, because the cameras always leave, then the commitment leaves with it. Okay, so that's one of the first ways, the cameras. Then we have compliance, and compliance is it's the technical commitment, right? It's the someone has told us that this is what we have to do, and so we're going to do it. And although that is a way, right, to start and it's a way to progress, what happens is people, I always say people will figure out a way not to do something. Okay. So if you give people enough time, at times there can be a dedication to figuring a workaround around the thing that this organization has to do. And it goes back to let's give a historical example, Brown v. Board of Education. So Brown v. Board of Education, of course, is the famous Supreme Court case, which is essentially ended segregation. It was in the school system, but it was like one of the first things that really started the end of segregation. Separate is no longer equal. Plessy v. Ferguson is no longer good law. It was a major victory. So people don't understand, though, that there was a backlash to Brown, right? So there was a backlash to Brown. So what do I mean, a backlash to Brown? The day after that case came out, there were legislators and legislation that was enacted that essentially kicked a lot of people, and it impacted Black and Brown families off of the social welfare rolls, right? So it impacted children, the aid, the funds that they were receiving, they no longer could receive it. And this was happening all in the South. There was a campaign that was mounted where children were literally starving, and legislators were doing this. Essentially, the thought process was, if you're going to make us integrate our schools, we're going to make sure that we punish you in some way, right? And so that's just like one very small example of how compliant. Then the other example, I can give one in Kansas. Yes, I will give one in Kansas. So there was a law so what we're seeing now is we're seeing lots of different legislation that's coming out, and people are calling it like the backlash to DEI, to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the laws that Kansas enacted said that basically, when you're hired on a job, you can't like take a pledge. You can't make people take a pledge for diversity, equity, and inclusion, that they'll uphold this. And so what has happened is that's one part of the law. So what has happened is organizations have looked at this, and this is in higher education, and they have gone to the other extreme. So they said, well, since this is a thing, we're now going to dismantle anything that has diversity, equity, and inclusion in it. We're going to, no longer have these affinity group, like going to the extreme. And it's interesting because that is the at times danger of compliant doing things because of compliance. At times people overdo, people underdo, or people just don't do. Right. So we have cameras, we have compliance, and then we have connectedness. And connectedness means that regardless of the cameras, regardless of the compliance, this is something that your organization is committed to. This is something that you were doing before. This is something that you're going to continue to do. And what is this thing? You are addressing disparities and disproportionality that exist within your system. So number one, you're aware, you know what it is. And number two, you're brave, right? So you're willing to have these very difficult and hard conversations. And then number three, it's connected. So I, was an administrator, and so I was considered to be, that I was in the kind of executive team. So what did that mean? That meant that there were lots of layers of people between me and the people who were actually on the ground doing the work. And what I found was that we could have a policy that we were implementing and that we were saying needed to happen. But if you didn't have the buy-in of the people who were actually doing the work, you're just going to have a policy that you're going to be yelling about from from the rooftops, but you're not going to have any buy-in. You're not going to have any dedication. You're not going to actually see what can actually happen when people are connected and committed to the work. And so what I have found, right, what I know is important regarding this work is it's so important to understand the why. Why are we doing this? Because no one wants to do another thing just to do another thing. Like, how does this impact my work? Why does this matter? why does it matter? And so when we think about disparities and disproportionality and how families have been impacted, we saw in the very first clip, it matters because the outcomes that families of color experiences are felt throughout the generations, right? When families are separated, when families are no longer together, it not only impacts that family, it impacts communities. And so we have to do all the things that we need to do in order to make sure that we're doing all the things that we need to do in order to keep families together. And one of the ways, and I actually have so this is a graphic. Let me actually acknowledge what you see on your screen. So this is an overview of the Skin Deep course. And in the course, I talk about how we even think about poverty. And that's rooted in Elizabethan poor laws in Europe. And poor people were highly controlled. Poverty was very much seen as a moral failing, all the different things. Well, that, of course, came over when we think about the colonies and then when we think about America as we now know it. And so in the course, I go through and I talk about not just because you can't really talk about just the child welfare system because the child welfare system is really new when you think about it. It's the 1950s, 1960s when we think about just the structure of it that we know about today. But really, when were families impacted, right? When did families need help? And when were families impacted? And what do we do about it as a system? So we have to look at like our drug policy laws, and we have to look at how we treated people when they needed help. And we have to look at how we treated people when maybe our nation has been in crisis, and how we've treated people of color when our nation has been in crisis has not been well. Right? It's not been well. And so I'm actually looking at my time. We have about, I want to leave maybe 10 minutes for questions. So we have about 8 minutes left. And so I don't think that I'll play the next clip. I'll just kind of talk through it a little bit. What I'll tell you is that the things that we see today are rooted in what we have seen in the past. So when I talked about poverty and when we think about like how white families have experienced this in Europe, I think about the laws that we have seen them. And one of the things that we've seen is homelessness and houselessness. So essentially, poor people were highly controlled, and it was because there was the bubonic plague that happened, and there was then a worker shortage, and poor people were the workers. So what happened was poor folks were like, hey, we can actually bargain. We can actually like go to better paying jobs. And so then what happened was they began the Elizabethan poor laws, they began putting in laws and policies that address this specific thing. So they like were no longer allowed to move between parishes. They couldn't negotiate their wages. Begging was a crime. And then they created these homes, right? So these homes, they had the poorhouses, and that was really for the disabled. But then they had what was called workhouses, and workhouses were terrible. It was a terrible place for people to be. It was depressing. It was a terrible condition for families to have to live in, and families had to live there if they were essentially homeless. Well, what was so bad about it? Well, a study came out, and 82% of the of the babies that lived in these workhouses died. Right, so the condition was that terrible and desolate. But think about what we do in our society when a family needs help, when they're experiencing homelessness and houselessness. And I know when I was practicing, if a family, we used to have to tell families, look, if you need housing, you're going to have to stay at a shelter for X amount of time so that you can get to the top of the list, right? You have to stay at a shelter so that you can get to the top of the list to get housing. And then when you think about just where we are now in our housing and its availability, then you think about how they treated the children, right? So children were required during that time, they could be taken as apprentices. So they could be taken and they could be forced to work till the age of like 21 and 24 at different people's homes. So this was happening in Europe. Well, then you think about how this impacted Black families. And let's not even talk about like in the course, of course, I talk about the transatlantic slave trade and slavery and the impact of that. But let's go a little bit past that and just talk about the apprentices, right? And how the eve that the eve that slavery was abolished, how former owners were literally snatching up Black kids and taking them down to the county to be to now certify them as apprentices. Let's think about how once the 13th Amendment came was abolished slavery, there was that one clause in there that said except for imprisonment, and how essentially being Black in America, how everything was criminalized. And I'm talking about like vagrancy laws, not having a place to live. Think about enslavement. Like you're free one day you're free and that's it. Like you're free. Okay. So then these laws were put into place that made everything about your freedom, everything about your poverty a crime, right? So that was Black families. Then we think about Native families and we think about just the theft of the land. And we think about Indian boarding schools and just the history of that and how the Indian boarding schools were really used strategically to end the Indian wars. Because what happens when you take children from a community? Right? It changes everything. So we have Native families, we have theft and assimilation, we have Latino families. So when we think about Latino families, you heard the data and we heard that they are underrepresented in some of the states, but they're overrepresented in about 20 states. And so it's important that we understand that and that we pay attention to that. And, sometimes we say things like, oh, it could never happen in America. That's not going to happen. But I think about when America was experiencing a social service crisis and specifically the Great Depression, and there weren't jobs. So what did the Hoover administration do? They created a slogan called Real Jobs for Real Americans. And what they did is they rounded up and they deported over 2 million Latino Mexican families. And it's estimated that 60% of those families that were deported back to Mexico, were actually American citizens. 60%. Right? This happened in the 1930s. And so it's important to understand our history so that we understand where we're going. So then we also think about Asian families and their interaction with the child welfare system and when they've needed help and when they've been impacted. And what's important to know about Asian families is that number one, there needs to be more research on the impact that Asian families have and what their needs are, because they have historically been ignored and tokenized, right? They've been deemed the model minority, which that kid that does everything right, that does all the things right, but there's some things that we need to pay attention to and make sure that we're addressing. And within the Asian community, what's very interesting is that they have the largest wealth disparity, right? So within that community and in the course, of course, I have like, PDFs and corresponding information and documentation, but the wealth disparity is so large within the Asian community. And that's so important. And, let's not even get into the Japanese internment and how they were taken from their homes and their land was taken. And then they were paid reparations. And then years later, they were paid reparations again for the survivors of those communities. And so why is this important? It's important because we don't talk about this history. We don't talk about this history, and then we don't understand why we have the impact that we have today. I told you I teach, and when I teach my course, what I see, we're not going to play that. When I teach my course, what I see is that even our books don't talk about it from the perspective of how other communities have been impacted, and so that's the key to understand the why so that we can build, I call it equity eyes, equity ears, and an equity voice to understand what's happening within our system so that we're able to say the thing that needs to be said because we understand the consequences of not saying the thing and not building that foundation. And so I'm going to actually stop here and just share a little bit about just Skin Deep, and you can see it on your screen, and you'll get I don't know if you'll get the PowerPoint, but I can absolutely share the PowerPoint. But essentially, I call it, kind of a deep course. So it's the workshop, and organizations work with my company to have these workshops because they know that they need to really kind of prime their workforce. They need to level up the awareness level up create that environment, create that culture and that connectedness. So they need to have kind of a workshop so that we can go deep together and have those conversations. And so we talk about the three Bs, right? Black, brown, and broke folks. That's what I call it. And how they've been impacted within our systems and how that shows up while understanding how we build those cultural ABCs, awareness, bravery, and connection. And then, of course, we have the course. And you saw a couple of clips of those. Well, this course is online, it's on demand. Individuals can purchase it, and then organizations also purchase it for their workforce because they understand that their workforce needs to understand and build those cultural competency muscles. And then some organizations are like, okay, we're not ready for the workshop, we're not ready for the course. We just need to talk, right? I need for you to come in and kind of talk to our folks about why we need to lay the foundation, kind of an introductory, and then racial healing and what that actually looks like. And you can't have healing without actually acknowledging what happened, all the different things. And so that's regarding Skin Deep. And then we think about, of course, the Racial Equity Collaborative, the organization that I'm the executive director over. If you would like to be on our mailings, would love for you to be a part of that. We send out just information and things that we do. We have, for instance, we're working with the healthcare organization where they want to have a different type of conversation with their physicians and with their nurses about racial equity. And so we did about maybe 4 or 5 focus groups, a couple of Spanish only focus groups. But with people of color, how have you interacted with the healthcare system? What does your healthcare system need to know, from the doctor to the nurse to the receptionist? When you come in, why don't you go back, right? How are you impacted? And then we're working with the screenwriter who then creates little plays, little scenes, and we act out these scenes in this professional development training as a way to just do an interactive and a different type of training for professionals who are engaged in this work. And so I'm just going to leave you with a couple of tips that we always share regarding the Racial Equity Collaborative. And this is the what, but it's not the how, right? So what do you need to do? Well, you need to make eliminating racial disparities a clear priority for your organization through words, finances, action, and support, right? What's going to happen when the cameras go away? Number 2, embrace the ambiguity of attempting new and creative approaches to eliminate racial disparities. What haven't you tried, right? What is going to be new? What's going to be different? How can you have this conversation in a nuanced way? And then number 3, spend time defining the problem of racial inequities within the organization. Oftentimes people don't know what their racial data is. And so just clearly defining that for the folks who are working within the system, and then making sure that people from the top to bottom know what that is so that you know what you're all working collectively towards. And then number 4, plan to make mistakes and seek authentic support and help. And we saw that with Bill, how he shared how he, said something that he shouldn't have said, and how he had to go back, right? He had to go back, he had to apologize, he had to make it right. But then you move on, right? So you say the thing, you acknowledge it, but you don't dwell in it. You don't start crying, right? You just have the conversation and you move forward. And so those are just some quick tips. And I know our time is winding down, so I'm going to stop sharing and just see if there are any questions or comments or anything that I can do with our 7 minutes together.
I'd like to say that this presentation was phenomenal, outstanding. I'm wondering though, in the midst of this in the midst of this cultural war that's taking place in America, how can racism be deconstructed when it's now just being demonized? And I see the ABC, but even the point of awareness is not allowed in many of the places now.
Yeah, I think that it has to be a very nuanced approach. It's why when I started developing Skin Deep, I didn't do it from the perspective of these are the this I did it from the perspective of history, right? how do you argue with history? Like these are literally historical events that have happened in our nation that are documented. And in the course, there's kind of 6 different modules, and there's about 21 different kind of big events that have happened. And it's talked about from the perspective of, but how have families been impacted? Because that's really the conversation that we need to be having. Like, how are families impacted? And then how do we ensure that we don't do that thing again? Because people who are I personally think that, yes, people outside of the system can influence change, but man, people in the system, they can see some things that people outside of the system just can't see. I remember when I was working with I was a part of the an organization, social service organization, and I started being contacted by these. It was actually women of color who were being denied a license, and my name was on the paperwork. It shouldn't have been, but it was. So I thought, well, I guess I'm going to address it. And so I started asking questions, right? So that's also a part of this thing. How can we ask curious questions to get more conversation? And we dive deeper into that in the workshop. But how do we get curious about what's actually happening within our systems? Come to find out, the policy was we just get to make the decision. Like literally, it was a policy. It was an arbitrary policy. There were no guidelines. There was no space for redemption. Like thinking about even the criminal justice system, we have expungements. We have like people get an opportunity to do something different with their lives. And in our administrative system, within the social service system, we weren't doing that. And so I just started having these conversations. Ultimately, come to find out, several women contacted me, and the people looked at it, they kept looking at it. They reached out right actually when I was about to leave and said, hey, thank you for bringing this to our attention. We've changed our policy. And these women who were denied access to this license have now been granted a license. And so, man, if we could just empower the people who are within the systems to begin seeing things a little bit differently because they understand history now, so that now they can compare it with their policies and their procedures to see, is this actually equitable? Does this impact families? And where do we go from here?
Thank you. Have you found a way to um, educate or get that history across to those that don't want to hear it or don't want to listen or believe it?
Well, I think that it's like with anything else. There are people who won't who won't ever, right? They just won't ever. They won't ever. They don't want to. They refuse to. It's not something that they're interested. So there will absolutely be a sliver of people that come from that space. And for those folks, it's like, you just keep doing what you're doing, right? You make sure that, yes, I understand that this is happening, but I'm still committed to what I'm doing. But then there are people who are experiencing the fear, right? Who feel like they're calling me a racist, or they feel um, I'm being asked to fix something that I have no control over, right? So they don't understand where their power lies. They don't understand that no one's calling you a racist. We're saying that racism exists within our systems, and how do we address that, right? How can we collectively address that? Why, right? Going back to the why, because families have been impacted, and it impacts not just our families, it impacts our communities, it impacts, it impacts neighborhoods. And so I think, when you have people who are at least curious about how do I make things better, then that is a way to engage in the conversation in a different way, so that people's defenses are down and they don't feel attacked.
Awesome. Thank you. We have some thank yous. Um, absolutely agree that it was a phenomenal presentation. Does anybody else have a question? We have about 1 minute.
I don't have a question, Shanelle, but I think Juanita's, I would just echo kind of what she was sharing and feeling, with the introduction of federal bills that are there to deconstruct, like calling out, deconstruct DEI. And of course, I work at a federal project. So that and my agency has, and my work, has always been about, addressing this disproportionality piece. And so I just think like I needed this today, and I thank you for your encouraging words. And it's just nice to know too who to lock arms with as we move forward. So thank
Yeah.
you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Melinda. Yeah, we're committed to this work, and sometimes that means reinventing it, right? Making it look a little bit different. But the message is still the same. But yeah, so just as much as folks are committed to dismantling, you have folks who are very much committed to ensuring that this work continues. Thank you all so much for your time today, and we'll make sure you have of course, my contact information. But thank you for the opportunity to share.
Yes, and you all can catch her at the MJJA Spring Conference in St. Louis. She will also be doing a workshop. So be sure to check that out. Thank you so much, Shanelle.
Thank you. Bye-bye. I'm headed to another meeting, so I have to hop off.
Thank you.
Great job.